High in Williams Canyon, above the mineral spring that gave the town of Manitou Springs its name, a narrow crack in the rock had been pushing cold air across the hillside for longer than anyone standing near it could explain. Local families had noticed the draft for years, a thin, steady exhale from stone that showed no other opening. In the autumn of 1880, two brothers walked the canyon wall following that current to its source, and found a gap barely wide enough to admit a grown man's shoulders. They widened it with hand tools, lowered a candle lantern into the dark, and found room after room threaded through the limestone below them, draped floor to ceiling in formations that had been growing, drop by mineral drop, since long before Colorado existed as a state, or Manitou Springs existed as a town. Within a year the passage had a name, Cave of the Winds, and a rail platform built to carry visitors up from Colorado Springs to see it. It became one of the first show caves in the American West, its main chambers strung first with oil lanterns and later with electric light, its guides trained to walk paying tourists through a fixed route that could be finished in under an hour. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. That hour of walking tour has never been the whole cave. The men who climbed down into Williams Canyon in 1880 had no instrument capable of telling them how far the passage actually went, and neither, in any complete sense, do the cavers who have spent the century and a half since then extending the survey deeper into the mountain. The commercial route covers a fraction of what has been mapped. What has been mapped, in turn, keeps meeting rock that has never been broken through, passages that narrow to a crawl and keep going, shafts that drop past the reach of a headlamp beam, air that keeps moving towards somewhere the survey tape has not yet followed it. Every few years, a renewed push into one of those unfinished leads adds another stretch of passage to a total that had, at some earlier point, been treated as more or less final. None of this made the openings themselves unknown to the people who had lived across this country for thousands of years before any of it became a subject for government survey or volunteer caving club. Archaeological work at rock shelters and cave mouths throughout the Rockies has recorded fire rings, worked stone, and hunting camps positioned at cave entrances across a span of thousands of years, evidence that these openings offered shelter from weather and a reliable place to camp long before anyone thought to measure the passages running back behind them. What lies deeper inside most of these systems, past the reach of daylight, is a separate question. The part of a cave that sunlight reaches and the part that never sees it have always been used differently, and the deep interior of a system like the one behind Cave of the Winds shows far less evidence of ordinary use than its entrance does. That distinction between ground a person could walk without special equipment and the miles of passage beyond it that demand real technical effort to reach runs through almost every chapter of this story. Cave of the Winds sits inside a formation geologists call the Manitou Dolomite, laid down as marine sediment roughly 480 million years ago, when the ground that would become the Front Range lay under a shallow sea nowhere near a mountain. That rock dissolves. Rainwater, made slightly acidic by the carbon dioxide it picks up moving through soil, has spent hundreds of millions of years working through the stone, following cracks and joints, widening them into passages, and in places opening them into rooms tall enough to swallow a flashlight beam before it finds a wall. It is a slow, unglamorous process, dissolution measured in fractions of an inch per century, and it is patient in a way almost nothing human-built is patient. The same basic process, repeated at different points along the spine of the Rocky Mountains, has produced nearly every known cave system from the Colorado Front Range north into Wyoming and Montana. Wherever the mountains expose a band of old marine limestone, water has been carving through it for longer than the mountains themselves have stood in their current form, since much of this rock was seafloor sediment long before the uplift that built the Rockies ever began. Further west and south, near the town that gave the formation its name, the Leadville limestone crops out across a wide stretch of central Colorado, laid down roughly 350 million years ago during the Mississippian period. During the silver boom of the 1870s and 80s, miners driving shafts through that same rock occasionally broke into natural voids that had nothing to do with any ore vein they were following, openings that predated their tunnels by tens of millions of years and led nowhere a mining claim cared about. When the federal government set out to map this stretch of the West in earnest, the effort had almost nothing to do with what lay underground. Ferdinand Hayden's survey crews moved through Colorado across the 1870s, one of 4 rival government expeditions racing to chart the interior West, cataloging peaks, drainages, and mineral prospects for a government eager to understand what it had claimed. Hayden's published reports are thorough on rock types and ore veins. They say almost nothing about caves. A 19th-century government survey had no instrument for locating a passage that showed nothing on the surface, and no line item for recording it once found by accident. Survey work of that era was built to notice ore and elevation. Hollow space hidden beneath both simply fell outside what the mission was designed to see. It would be more than half a century before caves themselves became a subject worth studying on their own terms, rather than an incidental hazard encountered while looking for something else. In 1941, a group of American cavers formed the National Speleological Society, built to bring some scientific order to a pursuit that had, until then, been left largely to local guides, curious ranchers, and the occasional mining engineer who broke into a natural passage while chasing ore and said nothing more about it. The society organized volunteers into regional chapters called grottos and gave cave survey a repeatable method. Stations set at fixed intervals, compass and tape readings logged by hand, passage measured foot by foot rather than estimated from memory. It is slow work. A single mile of surveyed cave can represent years of weekend trips by a small crew willing to crawl, wade, and climb through terrain that offers no view and no daylight to judge progress by. West of Vale, in the White River drainage, a cave now known as Groaning Cave earned its name from a low, moaning sound that rises from a fissure on the hillside under certain conditions, air forced through a narrow throat of rock by the same pressure differences that make the whole system breathe. Ranchers in the area had noticed the sound long before any organized survey began. When members of the Colorado caving community started systematically mapping the passage in the second half of the 20th century, they found a system that kept extending itself with nearly every renewed trip, until it grew into one of the longest cave systems documented anywhere in the state. Farther south in the same national forest, Fulford Cave has drawn a different kind of attention. Biologists studying the invertebrate life adapted to total, permanent darkness have documented animal populations there found in few other places in Colorado, creatures that have lost pigment and, in some lineages, functional eyes over generations spent somewhere sunlight has never once reached. 2 very different kinds of measurement, each developed well outside the walls of any single cave, have made it possible to say something about how large these unfinished totals might eventually become. One measures air, the other measures water. At Wind Cave in the southern Black Hills of South Dakota, at the eastern edge of the same limestone corridor that runs down through the Rockies to the south and west, researchers have spent decades tracking something the cave does entirely on its own. Wind Cave has only one natural opening to the surface, and through that opening, air moves in and out depending on the difference between the pressure inside the cave and the pressure outside it. When a storm drops the pressure outside, air rushes out fast enough to feel against a hand held near the entrance, and occasionally fast enough to produce the sound that gave the cave its name. When outside pressure rises, the cave draws air back in. Researchers have used the volume and speed of that exchange to estimate the total open space required to produce it, and the figure that calculation points to runs far ahead of anything cavers have actually walked and surveyed. Some published estimates place the mapped portion of Wind Cave at somewhere between 5 and 10% of what the airflow implies is really there. No single dramatic breakthrough has found the rest of it. Every known entrance has been searched. The unexplored volume that the barometric measurements describe is simply distributed through rock that has, so far, kept its exact shape to itself. The second measurement comes from the surface. Hydrogeologists working in this kind of terrain routinely use dye tracing to map connections that cannot be observed directly. A harmless, detectable dye is introduced into a stream or sinkhole at the point where surface water disappears underground, and monitors are placed at springs that might be fed by that same water, sometimes miles away and on the far side of a ridge. Across karst country in the Rockies and its foothills, these studies have repeatedly confirmed that a stream vanishing into one drainage can resurface days or weeks later at a spring with no visible surface connection to it at all. The water is taking a route that exists only underground, through passage no survey crew has ever walked, because no survey crew has ever found a way into it. None of this proves a fixed number for how much cave remains beneath the Rockies. What it shows, from two entirely different directions, air and water, is that whatever total has been attached to any one of these systems has already been revised upward more than once, and stands a reasonable chance of being revised upward again. In the years after grotto crews had mapped a good deal of what could reasonably be reached on foot, though, access to a number of these caves changed. Not because of anything a survey team had found underground, but because of something arriving in the dark from a very different direction entirely, and what happened next slowed the mapping of these systems more than any unclimbed shaft or unsupported ceiling ever had. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The threat did not come from beneath the ground at all. In the winter of 2006, biologists investigating a die-off among hibernating bats in a cave near Albany, New York, identified a fungus new to science, one that grows only in the cold, damp conditions of a cave in winter and spreads across the muzzles and wings of bats too deep in hibernation to groom it away. The fungus became known as the cause of white nose syndrome, named for the pale growth it leaves on an infected bat's face. And what it does to a hibernating colony is straightforward and brutal. Infected bats wake more often than they should during the winter months, burning through fat reserves meant to last until spring, and colonies that once numbered in the tens of thousands have been reduced, cave by cave, to a scattered few dozen animals, or none at all. The first sign, that same winter, arrived as a photograph rather than a lab result. A caver near Albany, out on a routine winter survey trip, noticed bats clustered near a cave entrance in broad daylight, behavior almost never seen in a healthy hibernating colony, and photographed several with a strange white dusting across their muzzles before anyone had a name for what they were looking at. By the following winter, biologists surveying the same region were finding thousands of dead bats on cave floors that had supported healthy colonies the year before, and it took several more years of laboratory work, growing the fungus in isolation and testing it directly under controlled conditions before researchers could say with confidence that this specific organism, rather than some secondary infection or unrelated cause, was actually responsible for the deaths. Caves matter to hibernating bats for the same reason they have always mattered to anything trying to survive a Rocky Mountain winter underground. They hold a nearly constant temperature and humidity, sheltered from the swings of a surface where nighttime lows can drop far below anything a small mammal could survive for months at a stretch. A bat in deep hibernation, called torpor, lets its body temperature fall to match the cave around it, and its heart rate drop to a handful of beats a minute, a state that conserves an entire winter's worth of fat reserve built up over a single autumn of feeding. It is an efficient system, refined over a very long stretch of evolutionary time, and it depends entirely on being left undisturbed. A fungus that forces a hibernating bat to wake early and often breaks that system at its most vulnerable point. The fungus does not stay where it starts. Spores travel on bat wings from one hibernation site to another as colonies move between caves each year, and they travel just as easily on a caver's boots, ropes, and clothing, carried from one system into the next without any cleaning in between. In the years following that first New York discovery, wildlife biologists confirmed the fungus in caves across most of the eastern half of the country, and it kept moving west, eventually turning up in bat populations far closer to the Rockies than anyone tracking it in 2006 would have guessed possible within a decade. The little brown bat, once one of the most common bat species across much of the country, suffered some of the steepest declines of any species tracked, in some hibernacular losing well over 90% of a colony within a few winters of the fungus arriving. Millions of bats died across dozens of species in total, some of which had never been considered at any particular conservation risk before white nose syndrome arrived. For an animal that reproduces as slowly as most bat species do, typically a single pup a year, losses on that scale do not recover on any timeline shorter than decades, if a given colony recovers at all. Federal land managers responded the way agencies usually respond to a threat they cannot see coming and cannot cure once it arrives, by controlling what they could control, which was who went into a cave or an old mine tunnel and what those people carried in with them. Abandoned mine workings turned out to matter here nearly as much as natural caves. Much of the same limestone that hosts the Rockies cave systems was also mined for lead, zinc, and silver across the 19th and 20th centuries, and the tunnels left behind, cool, dark, and undisturbed for decades, had become some of the most important bat hibernation sites in the region, even though no one had built them with that purpose in mind. Beginning around 2009 and 2010, the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the Forest Service began closing or restricting access to both caves and old mine workings on the land they managed, in regions where the fungus had not yet been confirmed, as well as regions where it already had, and worked together with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and volunteer caving organizations to develop a shared decontamination protocol for gear that had been used underground anywhere else in the country. Caving in this part of the country carries its own seasonal logic on top of any permit calendar. Many entrances sit at 9,000 feet or higher, reachable only by trail once snow has cleared enough to hike in safely, which in a heavy winter can mean the effective survey season for some systems runs only a handful of months before conditions close the approach again from the outside rather than the inside. A crew that loses a season to gate repairs, permit delays, or an early snowstorm on the access trail does not simply pick back up the following month, it waits for the following year. In the White River National Forest, where Groaning Cave and Fulford Cave sit within a few miles of each other, both systems moved under seasonal gates and permit requirements, closed outright during the winter months when bats are hibernating and most vulnerable, and open only to visitors willing to decontaminate boots and gear that had been used in any other cave system anywhere before going underground again. For the grotto crews who had spent decades pushing survey lines deeper into these two systems, the closures landed as a genuine loss, even among cavers who understood and largely supported the reasoning behind them. A lead that had been logged and left waiting for a return trip, air moving through an unexplored crawl that someone had marked on a sketch map and meant to come back to the following season, sometimes sat untouched for years at a stretch while permits were sorted out and decontamination stations were built at trailheads. Survey work that had once been a matter of picking a free weekend and driving up into the national forest slowed into something that required advanced paperwork and, in some seasons, no access at all, no matter how carefully a request was filed. The caves themselves had not changed in any of this. What had changed was how much of the year anyone was allowed to be inside them, and how much gear they were allowed to bring in when they were. A decontamination stop before entering either cave now looks less like a checkpoint and more like a small chemistry station set up at a trailhead. Boots and any other gear that touched cave floor scrubbed clean of visible dirt, then soaked for a set number of minutes in a solution proven to kill the fungus's spores, before anything is allowed past the gate. Ropes, knee pads, even the bag survey crews carry their notebooks in all have to go through the same process if they have ever been used underground anywhere else. It adds an hour or more to a trip that used to start the moment a car door closed, and cavers who have been doing this since before white nose syndrome arrived tend to describe the adjustment less as a burden they resent and more as one more piece of gear that has to be right before anyone goes underground. What did continue, even through the strictest years of closure, was monitoring. Wildlife biologists working under permit kept making winter counts inside gated caves specifically to track what white nose syndrome was doing to the bat colonies living there, entering in small numbers, under protocols designed to minimize any further spread of the fungus between sites, to photograph and count animals clustered on the ceiling in numbers that, cave by cave, kept shrinking from one winter to the next. Some of that monitoring extended into warmer months as well, using small tags attached to individual bats to track whether specific animals survived from one winter to the next, a slow way of measuring whether a colony was merely surviving in reduced numbers or beginning, cautiously, to recover. In a handful of well-studied hibernacula elsewhere in the country, researchers have documented colonies that appear to be stabilizing after the initial collapse, though nothing resembling the population levels recorded before the fungus arrived. Their counts, taken together, are now some of the most detailed records that exist of what is actually happening inside these systems year to year, not because anyone set out to document the cave for its own sake, but because the bats living in it needed to be counted, and counting them meant going back in, again and again, on a schedule the fungus effectively set for everyone involved. The survey crew's own older records did not disappear during any of this. The National Speleological Society maintains an archive of cave maps, station notes, and expedition logs reaching back to its founding, and the leads marked but never finished at Groaning Cave and Fulford Cave, along with dozens of other systems across the Rockies, are sitting in that archive exactly where the last surveyor left them, waiting for a permit, a weekend, and a crew willing to pick the thread back up where it was dropped. Some grottos use the years of restricted access to catalogue and digitize decades of handwritten survey notes instead. Work that does not add a single foot of new passage to any map but makes the existing map far easier for the next generation of cavers to actually use once broader access finally returns to a given system. None of this work is funded the way a similarly ambitious mapping project would be in almost any other field. Grotto expeditions run largely on volunteer time and volunteer gas money, weekends taken from regular jobs, gear bought and maintained out of pocket, survey data recorded by hand and typed up later by whoever has the evening free. The National Speleological Society charges modest membership dues and relies on that same volunteer structure to keep its archive current, which means that every mile added to a Rockies cave map traces back to someone's actual weekend, freely given, more or less indefinitely, for exactly as long as there is more cave left to survey. The scale of what patient survey work can eventually reveal is easiest to see at Jewel Cave, in the same stretch of the Black Hills as Wind Cave, where volunteer expeditions organized through the National Park Service and local grottos have added new passage nearly every year for decades. What began as a small mapped section early in the 20th century has grown, survey trip by survey trip, into more than 160 miles of documented passage, making it one of the longest known cave systems anywhere in the world, and researchers there still routinely find air moving through unexplored leads at the current edges of the map. Nothing about the Rockies limestone belt to the south and west suggests those systems are built any differently. What differs is simply how many volunteer hours, across how many decades, a given cave has received. Access has returned, in a limited and closely managed form, to most of the places it was taken away from. Seasonal gates still close many Rocky Mountain caves through the winter months, but permit systems now allow survey work and recreational visits during the months bats are active elsewhere, and decontamination protocols have become a routine part of caving culture, rather than a temporary inconvenience everyone expected to end. Some crews have started using laser scanning to record passage in 3 dimensions during the limited windows of time they have underground. A technique that can capture in a single visit a level of geometric detail that used to take years of hand survey with a compass and tape to approximate. Airborne laser mapping of the surface has helped in a different way, occasionally revealing subtle sinkholes and depressions in forested terrain that would be almost impossible to notice on foot, giving survey teams new points on the map worth walking out to and checking for an opening. None of it replaces the slow, physical work of pushing into an unfinished lead to find out whether it actually goes anywhere, which remains a job for a person, a headlamp, and a great deal of patience. Caves have also started drawing a different kind of scientific attention that has nothing to do with mapping their extent at all. Microbiologists have identified caves worldwide, including remote, rarely visited passage, as home to bacterial communities that evolved in near-total isolation from the surface, some of them already of interest to researchers studying antibiotic resistance and the search for new antimicrobial compounds. A passage that has never been walked by a person is, by definition, a passage whose microbial life has never been sampled, and every newly pushed lead in a Rockies cave is also, whether the survey crew is thinking about it or not, a first contact with whatever has been growing undisturbed in that rock for as long as the passage itself has existed. A different kind of record has been forming the entire time inside these caves, one that has nothing to do with counting bats or sampling microbes. Stalagmites and other mineral formations grow in thin layers over thousands of years, and the chemical composition of each layer reflects the temperature and rainfall conditions of the water that deposited it. Researchers studying formations like these in caves across the region have used them to reconstruct climate records reaching back tens of thousands of years, in some cases with a level of year-to-year detail that tree rings and ice cores cannot match for this part of the country. Every formation left untouched behind an unclimbed drop or an unexplored crawl is, among everything else it might be, an unread page of that record, sitting exactly where water has been writing it, drop by drop, for longer than anyone has been keeping any other kind of written record at all. None of this has closed the gap between what the airflow at Wind Cave suggests and what cavers have actually walked, and it has not answered the question a dye trace raises every time a stream disappears into one drainage and resurfaces, days later, in another. If anything, the years of restricted access widened that gap for a while, simply by keeping experienced survey crews out of caves they had been actively extending right up until white nose syndrome arrived. The underlying math has not changed at all. Somewhere beneath the peaks that draw hikers and skiers by the millions every single year, a volume of limestone large enough to move measurable amounts of air and carry traceable amounts of water has never been walked by anyone, mapped by anyone, or named by anyone. Reaching it simply takes more time, more permission, and more plain luck than most of it has received so far, and now takes a clean pair of boots as well. Cave of the Winds still runs its hour-long tour through Williams Canyon, past the same formations that have carried names since the 1880s, and most of the people who take that tour will never see anything past the lit path their guide walks them along. Behind the wall at the edge of that lit path, past the point where the tour turns back toward the gift shop and the parking lot, the passage keeps going, the same way it keeps going at Groaning Cave, at Fulford Cave, at Wind Cave, and at every other system along this stretch of the Rockies where a grotto crew has ever pushed a survey line into the dark and run out of daylight before they ran out of cave to survey. What lies beneath this range has never needed a hidden chamber or a lost civilization to stay unexplored. It has needed rock, water, time, a healthy bat colony left alone through the winter, and more of all four than any single expedition has yet had the chance to work all the way through. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.